Hello, people of the internet. Welcome to Pantheon's YouTube live stream. Steve Persh calling in from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today, we'll be talking about local development options with Drupal and WordPress. But before we get into that, especially because we want this stream to be a place where Pantheon staff meets our community, I need to acknowledge what I know many of you have seen on social media. Pantheon laid off a portion of our staff this week. I'm personally very sad to have lost some great close working relationships with some really great people. I can't wait to see y'all at the next camp or conference or just checking up online. Perhaps we'll be able to share some thoughts about local development and what we can learn here today. With that, I do want to bring in Pantheon Senior Software Engineer, Chris Reynolds. Hello, Chris. How you doing?
Hello. I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing okay, all things considered.
Yeah.
Focusing on some work topics, and excited to be talking about local development versus SFTP. On our live stream 2 weeks ago, Chris, we heightened some drama of the workplace. Today, perhaps we'll have some faux heightened drama of arguing about SFTP versus local dev, but there are more important things in the world. Speaking of people who know about important things in the world, one of the smartest people I know, Pantheon CTO David Strauss. David, so happy to have you on the stream.
Thanks for having me. It's been a long time since I've been part of the streams with going back to couch coding and
yeah. We were talking before going live here. I've been at Pantheon 7.5 years now. David, you of course co-founder, been with the company well over a decade. There was a time when live streaming wasn't so big of a thing, and we used, was it like Citrix GoToWebinar to do couch coding? And it was fun, but it felt like a mismatch. I am happy to be here on YouTube. Maybe one of these days we'll expand up to the simulcasting of Twitch and LinkedIn and YouTube, and that feels like a lot to me. We'll stick with YouTube for now. So our topic of the day is local development, and I want to ground us in the development options. How do code changes get out to the live site from that moment of bug ticket comes in, got to fix this thing? It might be a tiny code tweak, it might be a huge code tweak. How does that code change get out to the live environment? During the course of our stream today, I'll be showing what Pantheon has as a option available to anyone on Pantheon of SFTP mode, and Chris will be screen sharing after that to show local development on your own personal computer with a tool called Lando, and we'll close it out by talking about what the future might hold. But let's ground ourselves in the past. I like to start with some history. A question for all of us here. Was there a first moment where you realized that your status quo of development tooling or your local development setup wasn't good enough? I myself had kind of a blurry transition from amateur web guy to professional, but there were moments where I realized I had the works on my machine problem, where I had my lamp or my MAMP set up on my my Mac, where it took me an hour, but I got the WordPress or Drupal site running on my machine. I changed some code. I told my coworker I fixed the thing. They looked at it on their computer and they're like, "No, you didn't," or "You did, but something else broke." I was like, "Okay, this is it. This is a problem. We've heard from talking with other people that this is a common problem, and there are perhaps too many solutions." David, what about you? What was there a moment where you realized that what was working for you in the past wasn't going to work going forward?
It was pre-Pantheon, and it was back when I was at Four Kitchens, and what happened in the evolution of my own career there was that I went from me working on individual projects for sites or something where we might have a small collection of sites that shared code for a customer to cases where I became more and more involved in consulting on workflows for sites, consulting on performance for sites. This is back in the era of PressFlow. And it would be often a case where I would be on a project purely to fix a particular bottleneck or issue. And I would often be simultaneously involved in projects across multiple clients. And it just became really heavyweight for me to actually set up a local development stack that was suitable for each of the projects, either on a server or on a client side. And I often needed to resort to connecting with SSH and SFTP to one of the sort of staging environments that they had set up or a dev environment they had set up and troubleshooting there, especially for performance issues when having a representative environment is absolutely key to being able to diagnose something. Pulling something onto a local machine with a different MySQL version, without like the memcache, without the caching, just was not allowing me to actually troubleshoot some of this stuff. So I needed to be able to make changes in the actual environment.
Yeah.
And I mean, to me, it came down to like surgical changes on small, like on specific things, and it setting up the whole IDE and structure just wasn't going to be enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Time allowing, one of the things I want to show here, David, on the screen share in a few minutes is like, yeah, the new Relic integration that we have built in is really nice. Like on the stream a couple weeks ago, we were showing like, let's artificially slow down a site. I'll just throw in like a sleep statement. But in a real world situation where like the site is slow, but you're not sure why, it's really nice if someone or some company has just like pre-baked in application performance monitoring, because if it is a sleep statement, you can find that immediately. But finding that like one line bug fix, if that has to take like 8 hours of setup, just feels all backwards. Chris, how about you? Was there a time in your developer progression where you realized what was working for you at one point wasn't going to work at your next step?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty dramatic and very specific change. I entered web development as a freelancer. So when you're a freelancer, whatever you say works is the thing that works, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of that was probably SFTP, or pre-SFTP, even FTP, gasp.
Yeah.
And then I started working for a WordPress premium plugin called Event Espresso, which is a plugin. It's a totally different thing. And obviously we used Subversion for version control for the plugin. But like if I was doing a lot of support at the time. So in order to test out problems that people had, I had to have, not only like a setup that was like WordPress plus every possible extension, add-on for the plugin that we had, but also like what their specific combination is. And then again, it's like it's the works on my machine issue where like, well, I don't see it on my Mac computer running WAMP or MAMP or whatever variation at the time. And then there's obviously like a transition, from there when I started getting into agency stuff, and like now that thing doesn't work. So what are we using? And we were using Vagrant, and we were actually using a project called that a friend of mine worked on called VVV, which is varying varied vagrants, or varying. Yeah, so
I remember that.
basically allowed you to have multiple vagrants,
Yes.
and it would do the thing, because obviously, like as an agency, we're not just working on a single site, we're working a whole bunch of sites, and we need to have something that can spin up like a variety of things. So yeah, there's definitely like, various different periods of, and even that, like even Vagrant, like, I mean, I think Vagrant is great, but like one of the problems with it, that like containerized architecture fixes is that you can still have the works on my machine problem, because it's not actually like what you're saying, David.
Right.
Like it's not actually a representation of the thing that you're seeing on a live environment. It's sort of like, well, we can kind of get it halfway there, or kind of close.
It's interesting you mentioned subversion as well, because
Mm-hmm.
that was one of the other things that I was often rolling up my sleeves to tackle on these projects, which was, how do you actually do change management for what someone is doing, in terms of like, agile practices were way underway by that point anyway. So you had different people working on different cards. You had that work happening simultaneously. Some of it would be finished and QA'd and ready to go, and some of it wouldn't. And systems like Subversion really try to enforce a super linear view of changes. And sometimes what I would do on these projects is I would be in a case where the last code that had been deployed to a site was actually 6 months behind where all the developers were tinkering on trunk. And like my first step on those projects was basically be like, no, trunk is actually going to be what you have deployed, or something very, very close to it. And then we're going to tease out all these things and have them in orbit around your deployment pipeline, so that as the life cycle of these changes happens, in terms of inception of the change, QA of the change, sign off on it, and then ready for deployment, they can actually enter that stream to go out to the actual deployment. And this factors in a lot with this, because the way that you work on some of these tools, and the granularity of the changes you make, and the maturity of those changes, and how the team collaborates around those changes, is as much a product of how the changes get made as how they get integrated together when the team is actually pulling together version control and the QA path out to production. And Pantheon has always been built on a distributed revision control basis, in the sense that even when we were doing early Project Mercury stuff, we were working with Bazaar, not Subversion. And then when we built out the version of the platform that everyone's on today, we built that all around Git. But the one thing those two things both have in common is they were fundamentally built around the idea of having changes in orbit, where branching and merging were considered to be very straightforward operations. And like, branching and merging exist in Subversion, but if you've ever done it, you know that it's way too painful to actually have as part of your primary workflow.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Like, if it's too painful to do, people won't do it. and then have, like, it doesn't matter if you have it if people don't use it.
In some ways, a requirement to have this proliferation of development environments that you could actually make sense of is that you have to have tooling underneath it, where that proliferation doesn't become overly painful to reintegrate those changes later. Like in the Subversion era, you might have had a few copies of the code around, but you generally kind of had a trunk that people were committing to. And so the change management was actually, there was an extraordinary amount of gravity to get changes done directly on trunk. And with a lack of proliferation of the actual, say, feature branch and other environments and bug fix branches and things like that, the necessity for lightweight and easy to set up development environments and stacks was also lower. But that was downstream of that issue, in the sense that once you unlock the ability to branch, then the question becomes, well, how do you actually support people branching in all these different directions and having development stacks associated with them?
Yeah, that line of thought is reminding me so much of a few years ago, when continuous integration was an especially hot buzzword. Like, it's still a hot buzzword, but a few years ago, at least inside Pantheon, we were trying to really nail down what exactly did we mean by that word. And not like, I wanted to reference like the canonical blog post. Can't believe I'm blanking on the name of the person who wrote the canonical blog post on continuous integration. But one of the details was like, you must be merging to trunk or main every day. If you're not doing that, you're not doing continuous integration. I'm like, I think that is just a detail of, in those early 2000s, it was just too painful if you didn't do that. So that's why it was written in as a requirement to CI at that time. I don't think you need to merge every single day to meet the requirement of continuous integration today. That feels like it could be its own rabbit hole. Maybe I should, I'll steer us back onto the track here, and I'll get a screen share going of my local development environment. That'll just take a moment while I reconfigure some windows. David, a minute or two ago, you mentioned Project Mercury. What was Project Mercury?
So Project Mercury dates all the way back to even pre-Pantheon. And it is part of how we came together as co-founders to create Pantheon. Project Mercury traces some of its own history back to PressFlow, which is a what people have called everything from a friendly fork to a spork of Drupal, in the sense that it was never designed to diverge on a permanent basis. It was designed to provide a foundation for a set of patches for performance and scalability and their integration, so that whenever you would patch Drupal to be able to get that performance and scale, you wouldn't be caught unable to update your site easily, because of course upstream Drupal releases didn't include those patches. And in an era where most people were building their sites on things like Subversion, doing three-way merges on stuff was way too much to expect of downstream teams. So they so what I did is, and actually PressFlow's own history involves those version control tools to be able to do this sort of three-way merging efficiently. But it integrated those performance and scalability changes. But what Josh's insight was on some of that was that, sure, the like NBC Universals of the world and other like major users of Drupal at the time would be able to deploy PressFlow into their environment and take advantage of things like the proxy caching and database replication and extended support for object caching. But those tools were kind of out of reach for a lot of people. And what Josh did is he created an Amazon machine image, AMI, or AWS machine image, one of those two, that incorporated PressFlow, varnish in front, memcache, MySQL with some of the tuning parameters that I would often encourage people to use as part of the performance and scalability training that I would do at DrupalCon, which would be things like using modern engines for the storage and locking for scale. And then that would all get packed onto an image, and then you could put that out on what was the still very new AWS, and run a fairly scalable Drupal site from a single VM that would be able to take advantage of a lot of those integrations and features. And like, you could drive an extraordinary amount of traffic from one VM with varnish in front and caching set up properly. And then that came to briefly cover like the bridge over to Pantheon. What we did from there is we then experienced the challenge of how do we maintain those instances as they go out. And I worked with Josh on implementing configuration management. And then that eventually evolved into the very first Pantheon product that had dev, test, and live environments as a way for us to see how you could start doing change management as part of that foundation. And that's really where it comes into I'll hand it back over to Steve now that we're talking about like making changes to a site and not just deploying the production environment.
Yeah. So I've got screen shared here. The same demo site you may have seen on live streams the past couple of weeks, a bare bones installation of WordPress. And like every other site on Pantheon, it gets a dev, test, and live environment for all CMS sites, WordPress and Drupal. And as we saw, like 4 weeks ago. One way you can really slow down a site is just by putting in a sleep command. This is my big hammer of slowness that makes my site very slow. In the real world, I hope actually I do hope. I was gonna say I hope your performance problems aren't this simple, but actually if you have a performance problem that you can fix as simply as like commenting that out, I mean, go for it. But part of what we want to illustrate here today is that just getting to the point where you find like the one line change of code to be made to make your site load in like 200 milliseconds instead of 3000 milliseconds. Like just getting to this point where you find the one line to change could take you all day if you have to set up a too complicated local development stack. And in my experience as a professional developer at agencies working on one site at a time in the early 2010s especially, I was deep in the world of vagrant virtual machines that could bring a lot of power tools to running a full stack on my own laptop. But when those complex local tools cracked a bit, I was totally out of my depth as a web developer who knew about like HTML, CSS, PHP. When something broke in like the systems administration part, I was I could lose a whole afternoon to that. Especially if I were setting up the performance troubleshooting tools that I often needed. I think one of my worst days was when I had to spend like 8 hours setting up all of the application performance monitoring to find a bug that was about this simple. It was like after 8 hours, I figured out that I needed to change one token in Drupal to like cut multiple seconds off of page load times. And that was both satisfying to fix it, but also incredibly infuriating to think like, why did it take me so long to find this? So with Pantheon, I can click SFTP mode. Oh wait, what did I just click there? I don't know. I did not mean to click delete the site. But anyway, you could connect with SFTP. Connect with SFTP as I've done. I'm running in good old CyberDuck. I can just, dive into my WordPress root, go over to the file in question, and perhaps I should start over here. Although I won't go in great depth on New Relic here. We could do a whole live stream just on New Relic. One of the benefits that I'm getting with a platform like Pantheon is that I don't have to spend 8 hours setting up application performance monitoring to tell me where the slow part of my site is or just how slow it is. New Relic can tell me like, oh yeah, these responses are taking like 3000 milliseconds. Something is going wrong here. And it can point me over to this file. And it took me a couple months as a Pantheon employee to be swayed over to like, oh, maybe some things are this simple. maybe that David Strauss was onto something. When you're jumping between lots of sites, it is really nice to just be able to like click, 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 make a multi-dev, click, 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 open up New Relic, see the problem, fix it, hit save, commit in the dashboard, removing the slow part. There, I'm done. I did it. I'm committing directly to the dev environment here, which is connected to that master branch of the Git repository for this site. I could just as easily do that in a multi-dev for some troubleshooting scenarios. But like, still in the year 2023, this style totally holds up for many use cases. Before I take off the screen share, and next we'll be going over to Chris, who will provide some perspective on like, okay, but when is this not enough? When is this not sufficient? When do you need some more powerful tools running on your own machines? I just want to double check the chat, see if I've missed anything. Oh, Ryan Marks is telling me I panicked at the word delete there. I would just that click was me accidentally clicking the Git button here, which would have switched me from SFTP mode straight to Git mode and would have tossed away my uncommitted changes. That was the thing. That would have been deleted. Thank you, Ryan. Chris, David, any other thoughts on this style of working before we turn it over to Chris?
Yeah, like I sometimes like to compare it to a sort of cooking metaphor in the sense that when you're about to serve a dish or like just finishing it off, sometimes you want to get some browning on it, and you have the option to fire up the whole broiler, or like if you're in a professional kitchen, you could fire up the whole salamander. But sometimes you just need to do a little touch up on something. And so like for me, like I don't actually want to wait like 10 minutes, 15 minutes for the oven to fire up. I just want to use like the SFTP mode and just have just a quick touch up on the item so that I can just get that browning on that one file, that one change. And it just is really nice. Like you don't always want to pull out the whole rig just to be able to make a little change.
David, what exactly was that device? Was that, did I just see some fire or what was that?
It's a culinary torch with a flame spreader. And so it's basically like a little broiler that you can put over something. It's the SFTP mode of browning.
Great.
This live stream is literally on fire.
Literally on fire. Excellent. All right. Well, with that, Chris, your turn to bring some heat here. Tell us about containerized development on your local machine with a tool like Lando.
Yeah, sure. So when I joined Pantheon, previously we had used Docker, and we had sort of a custom Docker containerized setup, or you could use Vagrant, but we were sort of migrating away from Vagrant-based things because Docker is better. When I joined Pantheon, Lando was the thing that people were talking about, so I learned pretty quickly how to do that. So this is what I would do, setting up essentially to make that change or a change on that site. First thing that I'm going to do is a Terminus local clone of that. You can use Lando to pull this stuff down. I will also say before I even get into Lando that because Lando is based on Docker, Docker has now sort of a professional edition, but you can still install Docker for free, and Lando will still acknowledge or use the Docker that you have installed. But at least last time I looked at the Lando installer, and it may have changed in the most recent version, there's a checkbox where you can customize your Lando install, because Lando will bundle Docker, an older version of Docker, or used to bundle an older version of Docker into it. So if you customize that install and you uncheck the Docker container or the Docker desktop from that, and just use whatever you already have installed, then you can continue to use Lando, and it's awesome. So with all that said, I will.
Chris, can you increase your font size, please?
I can. It's probably, I don't know what's going on with but it's doing a thing.
So you've got Terminus local clone.
Yep.
Cache demo about to run, looks like.
Yeah, there we go. And then it will just give me a prompt when it's done cloning. It's going to clone to this directory that I'm already in. Yep, there it is. Okay. So now that I've got that, I can just say let's demo, see what's in there. Yep, I've got stuff. So let's see in that. And then let's open it in VS Code. There we go. Yeah, so we've got that site. We can see, I'm assuming that there will be an MU plugin that has bad code in it.
Who in their right mind would put a sleep command in a
Yeah,
must-use plugin?
right?
It's why the command get blame was introduced.
That's-
Steve would introduce sleeps into things, and then you could just find out
yeah.
who added the sleep.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
All right, so now what I'm going to do, because I want to do Lando so I can test this stuff locally, is I'm going to do Lando init. Oops, that's not how you spell init. Yeah, I did mean that. Lando init.
There's a super dangerous shell extension you can use for some Unixy systems that will take the suggestion and then just assume that you want to run it.
That's something I would only use in the safety of a container, and
Yeah.
maybe not even that.
So the first thing that Lando is asking me is where should it get the code base? Since we already did the Terminus local clone, I can just use the current working directory. This is what I usually do. So I'll use Terminus to pull it down, and then I'll cd into it, and then say current working directory. And then Lando has this cool Pantheon recipe, which means it builds a containerized environment that is meant to replica Pantheon's environment. So we can say that. I've got a couple different Pantheon accounts. This one is the one that has a machine token that I currently have saved, so I'm going to use that one. And then it's going to do some stuff. And then what it will do is it will end up creating a Lando YAML file after I tell it what site. So it's connecting to Pantheon based with my machine token. And I'm going to tell it that I want the cache demo site. And then it's going to create the Lando file. And then we can look at that. I think my computer is slow because of the streaming software.
That's all right. This interactivity of local development tools, like these interactive prompts, are just such a step above what I experienced with the Vagrant-based tools that I was using 7 years ago. I would have been in a much happier place with local development with Lando or DDEV, I think.
Yeah,
and I know someone. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, someone in the chat was prompting a Lando versus DDEV argument, and we'll have to save that argument for another stream. But both seem pretty good.
Yeah, so all that does, that init does, is create this lando.lando.yaml file. It just says this is what the name of the Lando site is. It's a Pantheon recipe. It's using the WordPress framework. This stuff is actually coming from Pantheon. So it's a WordPress site that uses the WordPress framework. The name of the site on Pantheon is called Cache Demo, and this is the site ID, which is kind of cool. And now, if I wanted Steve to be able to use Lando also, I could just commit this to my repository. And then he would have the recipe and it would pull down the site, and then and that's pretty cool. So you can share this file, which is one of the cool things about it. But before I do that, I need to start Lando because I've got the configuration, but it hasn't actually created any of the containers yet. So I'm going to use Lando start. And this will go about building the Docker containers, setting everything up, doing a lot of like hidden stuff under the hood. And then it will give us some URLs at the end that we can use to test our site locally. So this is all of the magic that you would use something like Vagrant or like some wrapper around Vagrant that created the site for you, and you didn't need to actually do it yourself. And this is some of the magic that in my previous jobs that other people did for me, or like other people had created the framework that like all I needed to do as a developer on a site would be like, start the server or whatever, and then it would like load up all this stuff if it didn't exist.
Vagrant up, was that the command?
Vagrant up. Yep.
Vagrant up, yeah. I know this can be a time-consuming step.
It's
Dare
actually
I
not too
ask?
bad,
All right, okay. Well, then maybe I won't ask
but you
a
can ask.
potentially time-consuming question. I was going to ask David Strauss, what is a container? I have watched like hour-long conference presentations that try to answer that question. So you don't have an hour, David. But what is a container?
So a container, like I'll list off the things that people associate with containers, and then it's really a container is usually some synthesis of those things, and not always a complete set of them. Um, it's almost like a lawyer testing out a concept of like, is something fair use or not? Like there's like 5 questions you ask, and then like if the preponderance of those questions is yes, then like it's fair use. But the like if for a container, it can represent various things. One of the things that it represents is a sort of portability abstraction for deploying a service or a collection of things from system to system, in the sense that as you move them from place to place, they are abstracted enough away from the foundations that when you forklift it over, whether it's from a local machine to production or between different stages of a say CI process, then the sort of references that it makes to the resources around it are stable. The port numbers stay the same, the paths stay the same, the relationship to network access stays the same. And this is also available in like non-container formulations. Like there's a thing on a lot of Linux systems called like systemd portable services that is that concept in isolation, but not a container system. The other thing that containers do is they isolate, in the sense that one workload to another, it can manage things like, say, how much CPU is available, how much memory is available, how much block I/O is available, in a way where you're able to deploy workloads that might have contention over the same resources to a system and have them shared in a predictable way. And because of that, say, abstraction for delivery of a container in terms of the resources and references, that starts to represent a much more complete package where it's a portable deployment that has an expected amount of resources underpinning it in terms of things like memory and CPU. It provides a unified entry point to launching, say, an application, where there's a standard way for, as you drop it onto a system, for it to fire up the world of what needs to run in that container. It can even represent a concept of freezing and portability, where we don't use this at Pantheon, but you can do things like, say, try to freeze the memory and running state of a container and move it to another system. There's debate over whether this is safe or not.
All right. Well, let's pause the explanation there, because Lando has now fully started.
Yeah.
And we'll get back to containers and their safety and future in just a moment.
Yeah, so when it's done doing its Lando start for the first time, it installs all those containers. It tells you Lando is really nice in that it tells you what it created. It created an Nginx app server, an app server, a database server, a caching server, Edge SSL, all those sort of things. And you've got these handy dandy URLs. The ones that you're probably most going to be using locally is probably one of these two, the friendly ones, which is really just project name cachdemo.lndo, like Lando, except without the A. .site. The .site is nice because I know not terribly long ago, the standard practice for developers was to tag throw a .dev at the end, and then googlebot.dev. So now we can't do that anymore. So it's probably only a matter of time before Google buys .site, but until then, we don't need to worry about those clashes.
Well, .website is
mm-hmm.
a top level domain that you can have. I've got Al Gore .website and at least one other.
Yes, that is very true. And I will point out too that there's occasions when these other sort of local host with a port number URLs are useful. That was something that when I was working on the Edge integrations project, I was using specifically to test the headers that were getting sent back and forth, which weren't being sent back using the regular things. But in most cases, you're just going to use this, and I can just open up a browser. It's going to open up in the wrong window. But if I drag it over here, you will see that there's my site. Oh, but it's I don't have any of the files. Somehow it remembered that I had probably a previous install. So it already has the database, which is handy. But I don't have any of the files. So what I need to do is I can do a Lando pull. And this is telling Lando to pull down whatever I want. And this is what you would also do if you wanted to use Lando to pull the code from Pantheon. In this instance, I am not going to do that. I'm just going to, because I already have the code that I want. So I'm going to say no. I will pull the database just to make sure that it's the latest version. Like I said, if this is from a previous install and Steve has done some stuff, then I might have outdated data. So I'm pull that from dev, and then I'm going to pull down the files. And it's going to do it's basically like a lot of these Lando tools sort of wrap around stuff that you would otherwise do in Terminus. So it checks the machine token and does some stuff. Right now it's dropping the WordPress database that's already installed so it can pull down a new one. And then it does a search and replace so that the cache demo.lndo.site URLs are replacing the Pantheon.io URLs that I would get. And now it's downloading all of the files that are on the server. And when I'm done, there it is. Now I should have everything that, yep, there's actual pictures, except for one that's still broken, but that's okay. And I can log in. I'll blame caching.
It's always a safe bet.
Yeah, it's probably. And surely I will be able to log in at some point.
There's a lot of entropy there.
Yes, possibly too much.
Yeah, I'll take your screen share off the stream just in case. Just in case. Let me know when you want it back.
That was actually the wrong one password login.
That's all right.
That's the problem with having multiple.
See, what I do for demo sites is I use
password. Yes.
I mean, it's not quite that simple, but it's pretty short because, like, I mean, if someone really wants to hack my WordPress demo site with 2 posts on it,
there we go. All right, it's safe now.
All right. Hello.
All right,
we have a WordPress site running.
Yeah, so we're logged in, and we can see that it's got content. It's got posts that were pulled down from our Pantheon environment. It's got all of the images. What's cool is like all of these actually work and they're local and they point to the right places and it's magic. Yeah. And I didn't have any of this stuff before.
There is a question in the chat here from Carson. Is there an easy way to do a file proxy instead of pulling down all the files?
There are ways. I wouldn't characterize them as easy.
All right.
Yeah. It's been done, and I have I've seen it done. I have not successfully repeatedly done them myself.
Mm-hmm. I know that in the Drupal world, there's a module called, I think, Stage File Proxy that was growing in popularity just as I exited my last job 7-ish years ago and came over to Pantheon. So it became less urgent for me to need that. It's far more helpful to have something like that if we're talking about like gigabytes upon gigabytes of images. I don't have a, I don't know. My gut tells me if you're dealing with an uploads directory that's smaller than a gigabyte, maybe even more than that, just bring them down. It's way simpler to just bring them down. But
If it was that much more, I would probably look for a proxy thing that would pull them from outside the site, and then you have to find stuff. But I would feel like, yeah, if it's much more than a gigabyte, then I would probably find an alternative.
Another question here is Lando pull aware, or does it need to be aware of the DB character set? I'm curious if our database syncing needs to make accommodations for any differences between UTF-8 MB4 and plain UTF-8.
It should account for that.
Yeah.
Part of the actual database dump itself, like the
Yeah.
schema itself that is part of the database dump defines the character set for the tables.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and a lot of, like I said, a lot of what Lando does is wraps around other things, especially with these commands. So like a lot of those Lando commands are either wrapping around Terminus doing a thing, or wrapping around WP-CLI in this case doing a thing, or wrapping around Drush doing a thing, or wrapping around Terminus, wrapping around WP-CLI or Drush doing a thing. So yeah, it's not doing anything that you wouldn't expect if you're familiar with those other tools.
This should also be decreasingly a problem. Especially on Pantheon, we switched quite a long time ago over to MB4 as a default, because if you're using things like the extended parts of emoji, then it just won't work on the somewhat misleadingly named UTF-8 character set in MySQL, because it doesn't actually handle the 4-byte stuff. Ideally, everything should be MB4 going forward, and should be for years. And if you're still working with any stuff that is pure UTF-8, I typically recommend swapping that out if it's not too difficult.
All right. Thank you for bringing that expertise, Chris. We're now 13 minutes from the top of the hour. It's just a YouTube live stream. We could hang out here all day, but I'll try and cap us at an hour. Are there any more Lando niceties that you want to show us?
I mean, honestly, like Lando init, Lando start, and Lando pull are the three things that I use most frequently. You can get really in depth. You can like customize your Lando containers. You can add config files. You can customize like the Nginx config. You can do all sorts of stuff. But those are the things you can SSH into Lando, or use it to wrap around WordPress or Drush. Or Terminus.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's the main thing. That like I said, those are the three things that I use the most, and I use Lando pretty much daily.
Yeah, the Lando SSH one is one where I'm curious about your personal preference. Like when I've used Lando, I've been uncertain about, when I run a git command, for instance, should I be running that from inside the Lando? Should I Lando SSH and then should I just, for the time that I'm working on the site, should I be living inside of Lando, or should I be outside of Lando running all of these Lando commands?
It's possible I'm not the best person to answer.
Well, that's why I ask, what do you do?
Because what I do is yeah, I do not want to be inside the container, because these containers are built to not be inside them, and once you are inside them, then it's can be difficult to get to understand, like, that there's a discrepancy, and that there is stuff in there that doesn't exist outside the container. So I would prefer to have all my stuff, like, that I need, like Git and Terminus and whatever, installed on my machine, as opposed to dropping inside the container and running that stuff from within the container, because it becomes a black box that you just don't know what's in there and how to get that stuff out anymore. And therein madness lies.
I would agree with Chris here. Like, if your tools are about manipulating your working copy in terms of your code, then it makes sense to be doing that on the outside. And if you're running something in the context of, I want to run this as if it's part of Drupal or WordPress, then that's something that actually needs to run inside the container.
I will say that, like, because we're talking about virtualization, there's going to be latency because you're talking to something that's inside of a container and whatever, as opposed to like directly manipulating the stuff from within the container. But realistically, I mean, that's sort of like a cost of doing business, as far as I'm concerned, for like development. Like, this is just how it would work better. I don't want to be inside the container because it scares me. It's dark and cold.
All right. Well, that might be an excellent transition point to asking David about the future of containers. I think, David, as I cut you off on the question, what is a container? You're talking about safety of containers and unsafe things you can do with containers. But considering we've only got a few minutes left here, what changes do you see on the horizon for development workflows? We've seen the SFTP mode that has been on Pantheon for a decade plus still is really nice for certain kinds of tasks. The manipulation of containerizations that I think first was pioneered partly by yourself and platforms like Pantheon on servers has made it down into tools like Lando. There's polish on containers that now run on laptops. What's next?
I think the ultimate measure and evolution of maturity in this sort of ecosystem is when you actually stop having the conflict between choosing disparate ways of doing something because you create a convergence where a way of doing something that's portable and integrated is able to solve those use cases. I've sometimes this is a tiny detour, but I sometimes think about the audio stacks on Linux systems where we had this consumer one, Pulse Audio, and a professional one that was designed for low latency. And one was easy to use, and one could accommodate professional needs. And ultimately, both of those are getting replaced by a stack that is both easy to use and able to accommodate professional needs. And I see the ultimate evolution of this stuff as something where we see technology like, say, Dev Container, which is commercialized on GitHub as code spaces, where you have a solution that you can either pull the containers down to a local system and interact with them with Visual Studio Code, or you can run the containers up on a server and still run your local IDE and connect to them, or you can run the IDE and the containers up in the cloud. And it basically gives you this whole spectrum from that spans that gamut from extremely quick to fire up in terms of being able to make quick changes and not having to set up lots of local resources, all the way over to an extremely robust tool set in terms of the things that people expect in IDEs around things like debugging tools and a configuration that is actually integrated with the project, and syntax and object awareness and refactoring tools and all these other things that you expect out of that rich environment. And at that point, you stop having as much compromise. This was also the case with how we designed a lot of the edge stuff at Pantheon around things with our integration with our CDN, where it's there's historically been a tension between the idea of, do I cache it for a long time or do I provide my users with fresh content? And we just obliterated that challenge by making it so you could store something at the edge for a long time, and you could also invalidate it across the globe right from the CMS. And so at that point, it no longer becomes something that's in tension. And if we can have tools here that are able to solve Steve's use case of, I work on a whole bunch of sites and I need to be able to fire up my dev tools in a quick way and be able to get to work for simple changes. And Chris's use case of, I want to have this rich set of tools that allows me to dig in deep, make complex changes, test them out, see what effects that they have, be able to dig into all the underlying pieces that are running those that are providing the infrastructure for that stack, and seeing exactly how it all plays together for say something that might affect, say, the schema of the database and code and other aspects. If we can unify those things, then there's no tension at all. You'll choose the same thing whether you need to be working 40 hours in a week on a code base, or whether you're dabbling in a different piece of code every 4 hours.
That's one of the exciting things. There's a project that has kicked off fairly recently that basically allows you to run an entire WordPress, like server and all, inside the browser. And like that's
Awesome.
yeah, so like that combined with other like web-based IDE sort of tools means that you never need to have, you could be coding on an iPad, you could be coding like on a phone, and you'd be able to actually, you know, see the changes that you're making, and that's pretty, that stuff is pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I have seen at least the demos on Twitter of people using some of the AI tech to just, you know, use a phone, tell the AI, write this code. It writes it, and like they're in an IDE on their phone, and it, like, at least in the demos, it's working. And perhaps we'll see that on a future live stream. This feels like a great spot to wrap it up. David or Chris, thanks so much for being here. Any more closing thoughts you want to share? Shrugs.
Stretch all around.
Sounds good. Well, thank you again for joining. Thanks so much, those of you, for watching, and have a great week. Bye, everybody.